shared. Whoops, there we go. Recording. That's why we need a backup to have the beginnings and the end if we forget to record right at the beginning. Okay. When Mio and I are trying to do that occasionally. Okay. The so I'm illustrating these contrasts and then linking them, as we do at the USC, with some of the best thinking about these questions from the ancient Greeks and Chinese to the very present. What was a philosophical question in the time of Kant and Hegel was reformulated by Marx, by Max Weber, by Emil Durkheim, Alfred Marshall into social science disciplinary questions as these fields emerged in the 19th century. Similarly, as political parties and nations, from the American Revolution to the Russian Revolution to the lifestyle revolutions of 1968, 1989, students in Paris, Tiananmen Square, the fall of the Berlin Wall, all of these profoundly challenged the answers about right and wrong and how should we live and how were new institutions created after those revolutions, which continue in social media today. People talk about millennials or different age groups and so forth in ways that we can try to interpret more generally. The kinds of answers that emerge from these, as well as subdisciplinary revolutions within the social sciences, are illustrated, for instance, trying to generalize and make more powerful sense of them, are illustrated by Robert Merton's writing on the history and sociology of science, and how he showed that from his Marxist background, technology and power of different scientific bits of knowledge in the colonial empire of the English, joined with the values of innovation and Protestant moralism in ways that Max Weber had analyzed. Or here at Chicago, Frank Knight in economics and Edward Shills in social thought, sociology, imported Max Weber and European theories of relativism, of how values transform institutions, like the rise, to interpret better, the rise of the West, and the European theories of like the Protestant ethic as Max Weber used it, in contrasting with the Confucian deference of China and India, and then the ancient Jews, where the example of Jesus Christ was not just one person, but was relativized in ancient prophets, showing how these individualistic attacks on authority and hierarchy that we had in 68, 89, 1989, go back to the ancient Jewish prophets in that sense of challenging authority. More recently, the Frankfurt School in Germany of Adorno, Horkheimer, and Jürgen Habermas, plus combining it with Habermas with American pragmatism philosophy, joined with some specific institutions like Hollywood, the coffee house in England, and the cafe on the continent, to illustrate specific mechanisms that change how we think. To Jean Piaget, Piaget, who stressed socialization and development of young children following our parents when we're quite young, but by age 20 or so forth, breaking sometimes with these, or at least asking and potentially reinventing that tradition in ways that make it more individualistic. This explicit introduction of changes over age challenge the kind of question and answer offered by many like Pierre Bourdieu, who in his book Distinction, or writing about domination, would basically answer the upper classes dominate the lower status persons always. Piaget suggests we may go through this at age 10 in ways that are different at 25, relativizing the answer of a Bourdieu, of saying, don't look for domination. And one could ask, how much is this also true of the glass ceiling or African Americans or others? How much are these true at a younger age, or when you move from, let's say, the deep South in a small town to a big city, or a tolerant college town which has never heard of racism, etc. Okay, so in these ways, I'm introducing these examples in a slightly challenging way of how relativism can make a difference for all of us. Within the discipline of anthropology, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Mary Douglas, and Clifford Geertz, all in the 50s, 60s, basically said, you know, you anthropologists have been studying villages in Africa and Brazil, and you're building an anthropological discipline on these, but guess what? There ain't no isolated village anymore. We are part of a global world, and showed that the Australian Aborigines, the Brazilian jungle residents, are in contact with London, Paris, New York in ways that make them no longer the isolated villages that are assumed if you do a community case study, or which has also been assumed in the past and sometimes even closer to present in some of the Chicago sociology anthropological work of ethnographic thinking, which comes in part from this anthropological background. The answer of Lévi-Strauss, Douglas, and Clifford Geertz was basically to build more abstract theories. Don't ignore the villages, but look where and how the contacts with different subgroups, new values, the migration patterns, how these things are transforming Jamaica, where we have many people going to London and then coming back and transforming, taking rap music to London, bringing it back to Jamaica in ways that when it comes to New York, it gets used in a more politicized way. When it's in Chicago today, it becomes part of it inspires parts of house or drill or rap, and that artistic slogan, as was observed. Well, I'll come back to that and just leave it that way for now. But pointing to that example of rap, which Orlando Patterson, a sociologist at Harvard, has written about with his own Jamaican background, and how like cricket, it looks as if it's just something out there as a game, but in fact it has important cultural and civilizational impacts. Lévi-Strauss concluded yes, we should not just study Brazilian villages, but look at their myths. Look at what they define as correct and immoral, or whatever, gender roles between men and women, between brothers, cousins, and then different types of cousins. But he then added an explicit comparative analysis, analogous to Max Weber with a Protestant ethic. He said, look at a matriarchal compared to a patriarchal society or a village. In a patriarchal society, you have the Oedipus myth, that the father is punishing the son, and the son is revolting against the father and spends the rest of his life trying to make up for having violated the father's values. And using instead the Brazilian myths in matriarchal societies, where women are dominant and poor men have to carry around their wives on their shoulders, and women are cutting their livers out by taking them into, that is, in some myths, you have destruction through fish, through honey, through smoke, through these hundreds of myths, which he has numbered. Myth 27 becomes inverted and transformed when it becomes not patriarchal, but matriarchal, and cross-cousin marriage can then transform the society if it's stronger, and the myth in turn changes. Okay, so these transformation rules of how culture changes in conjunction with patriarchy, that is authority, and how that in turn transforms and interacts back and forth with the myths is what we can talk about as culture, values, and civilization, and right and wrong. The anthropologists thus have concepts like cultural relativism, hybridity, which implies the combination of two kinds of ostensibly conflicting values into a particular style. Susan Sontag has invoked as an aesthetic principle, coming in part from the French background, but she has discussed the concept of camp and campiness as illustrated by how you can dress, as well as types of music, as well as Mozartian characters. So she has a wide-ranging set of things that is illustrated by wearing a denim miniskirt with cowboy boots. Campy, combining things which don't apparently belong together to generate a sense of shock and an aesthetic statement, which then can be transformed. Okay, so that kind of I'm invoking these examples from Levi-Strauss to Susan Sontag to say, this kind of shock, which you may feel if you come here as a foreign student or you go to a different neighborhood, from one neighborhood to Chicago, that is the beginnings of this, or in terms of preferences, you can say we're maximizing preferences, but where and how do these preferences get defined? We want to join some of the best thinking about these with the models of markets as well as of institutions, as the economists discuss them. And it's no surprise if you look closely that the economists have been doing this for much of the 20th century, and even today, that is the image of the Milton Friedman free market anti-state does hold for some, but especially even today, we've got wild economists doing all kinds of things that go way beyond the bounds of most of the social sciences, such as the concept of amenity, a core concept we will use in this course. And the economists 30 years ago started studying smoke, clean air, the environment, the politics and the economics of these choices, and trying to use the most powerful economic theoretical tools to say, how can we make sense of these non-market goods and services? That is, things which you don't buy and sell. So Alfred Marshall in the late 19th century had talked about externalities, things which are external to the market. So we then get Gary Becker and his students, others, George Tully, here saying we can analyze these, and Ed Glaser at Harvard, now a student of them, basically saying, let's use the best powerful tools we have, but we want to apply them. And Glaser has said, cities and the world are more affected by non-market transactions than they are market transactions, and shown this with studies of people's happiness, that happiness is less affected by what you just buy and sell than it is by having personal relations, having a good family or quasi-family, as I talked about last time, that African-American mothers and sisters may have, and and that's one illustration of something closer to Levi-Strauss's matriarchal society, because these women create political leadership in our mayor, in the city council. Look at the number of African-American women in the city council. Look at the civic groups. My own city council member, alderman, is Sophia King. We have these in ways that we can begin to label and look, if you open your eyes, at the matriarchal elements and how these are transforming the myth. So the street, which was going through downtown Chicago, going out to the expressway became the Ida D. Wells street just in the last administration of Laurie Lightfoot. These, who is symbolized in the names of streets, are part of Levi-Strauss's myths that we can see on street names in Chicago, implemented by our most recent mayor, even though she's brand new in terms of these kinds of traditions. I mentioned the anthropologist, similarly with Edward Shills here, his student Gabriel Almond, Sidney Verba, who with Verba and Almond did major international studies of political culture. Daniel Elazar, studying these things initially within the state of Illinois and within different cities, and then going back to the ancient Jews, the ancient Greeks, in 50 books, elaborated how these things come together. So these, I'm suggesting these are ways in which these bigger questions are underlying the sections of this course in ways that link with the questions which have been asked by two of you in a manner that may not sound as if their answer, but I'm pointing out explicitly where we can find these kinds of answers. Okay, I did that very quickly. I'm mostly mentioning names that you may or may not know. Some of their part, that is, I would say every name that I mentioned here, if you're in physics or economics or sociology or art history, you should all know these names. These are part of general education, and it's one reason that many of you are taking this as part of general education, not just a disciplinary answer, but the disciplines, the smartest thinking in some of these disciplines can inform and enlighten as they have within these subgroups whose names I've mentioned. Okay. You don't need to read many books by these people, but knowing enough so that you can say a few more sentences than I have, and you'll get some of that here, and you can get a little more on your own as appropriate, is something which is valuable. Similarly, I'll mention explicitly when Mio mentioned that she's had a couple of Chinese and other friends from Asia asking about how much is the use of Chicago or American history something which is going to be difficult if you're not an American? And my answer is, if I'm invoking these things as I did on Monday and now, these are part of world culture, which every educated Chinese citizen should know. So I'm not saying you should know this because you have to be an American and pass an exam to become that. That is, Lipset pointed out, in China, you've got to be born, or in Nazi Germany, it was racial. In America, the conception of citizenship is what you need to pass an exam on to become an American citizen. That is, these aspects of American is not citizenship. This is part of general culture that educated university people in China should know, as well as Americans should know at least about who was Genghis Khan, who was Mao, what was the Cultural Revolution. This is part of world culture that every educated person in South Africa or Tibet should be aware of. And Martin Luther King, these are global names, not just country specific. Okay, and they all carry important implications for understanding ourselves and our world better if we look. Okay, so if that's our agenda, it's an ambitious agenda. We'll do it imperfectly, but at least we'll take this on. And I'm also saying implicitly, I'm not trying to give you my view of what's right or wrong, or my view of this or that. Even though I studied with a number of these people and worked with them, these are not my answers. These are core questions which have evolved with civilizational historical development, as well as intellectuals writing in Greenwich Village or in Paris or Rio de Janeiro. Let me give you one example. Okay, I'm now going to give a couple of specific examples that sound ad hoc, perhaps, than they are, but they're big ideas which have really brought lots of insight. And let me give you one. Probably one of the most challenging of the three things I mentioned last time is the rise of the arts. Okay, the rise of the arts is mostly within Northern Europe and the US and Asia, let's say, not the European continent, especially France. Why? The one clear answer to this is in the two names I've just mentioned, Jürgen Habermas, and last time I mentioned Walter Benjamin. These were both German Marxists, brought up as Marxists and fighting, arguing, sometimes explicitly, more often implicitly, with a Marxist answer to why did the industrial society emerge and how is it changing ethically, and what lessons does it have for a post-industrial society? And in their concepts, and I'll mention the more narrow, in the Walter Benjamin case, in his essay on Paris, in his fat book on the Arcade Project, he introduces, I'll just mention one concept of the flaneur, the person who wanders around shopping, maybe with a black top hat, a ballerina on his arm. They stop in front of stores and say, isn't that a nice pair of shoes for you, or an umbrella, or a cravat for your throat, etc. Why is this an answer to these big questions? Because it says the key to the economy is not production, it's consumption. And this is the hottest issue in China today. How to build that insight into cultural policy, which the Central Committee of the Communist Party is debating. Benjamin had an answer. Jürgen Habermas had a more, so his answer was look at Paris, and where and why is Paris and the subgroups within Paris of the poet. His major source of data was the poems of Baudelaire. Baudelaire was the leading aesthetic intellectual of 19th century France. So it wasn't that he was just a random poet. He was a major person answering these kinds of questions that I have asked for young people in France in the mid to late 19th century. And he brought in Wagner, he brought in Bohemia, he brought in all kinds of styles, and an anti-bourgeois style, which was mirrored or extended in 1968 and 1989, and the counterculture and so forth that we have today in diversity. So if that's an historic Parisian answer, this was taken in a more comparative cross-national perspective by Jürgen Habermas in his Habilitation, his big doctorate. And he basically contrasted, to simplify, the Parisian cafe and the London coffee house. What happened in those two institutions? Anybody want to try to answer that? Why were they so different? And what made them different? And how do they answer these questions? That's a medium challenging question, but if anybody's, some of you may well have read and worried about this yourselves. That is why I mentioned last time that civic organizations, one person said, what's a civic organization? I said, oh, that's an English conception. Why did I specify English? Because historically it was hundreds of years old and it's brand new in France, basically, and on the continent, and in France, and in China, and in Japan, and in Korea. Why and how did these emerge in Asia recently, and why did the English answer have deeper historic roots? That's the answer which you get from Habermas. Basically, that the London coffee house emerged in a political context where there was enough division among the top leadership from the Normans and the Saxons to the Dukes to the rural and the urban, that there was not a single dominant elite, the way that you had in France from Francis I in the institutions he created. He created the Académie Française, the French Academy, which said, this is French and this is right and good. And I, at the head, and this academy advises me, the king. And that sense of creating institutions, and there were then more academies, Academy of Science, Academy of Social Science, Academy of a couple of sorts. And you have these, where do you have these in the rest of the world? You have them in China. Where do they come from in China? They came from the Russians after the Russian Revolution, or that is along with the Russian and the French Revolution. That is, these French institutions, which were created hundreds of years ago, dominate the intellectual life of strong states with a strong hierarchical leader who says, I want to use but also control intellectual thinking. And so the academy is an institution designed to do that. It gives prizes, monetary prizes. It would send leaders. It sent Tocqueville to America. Tocqueville was sent by an academy that paid him to go and study and bring back this knowledge so the king and the French state could use it. That's like Chinese cultural policy today. By contrast, the German and the American university tradition comes from England. I won't say the German, but I mean, the American tradition combines the German research with the English decentralization. But the decentralization part I'm stressing, and I'm following Habermas, basically is that of the London coffee house, the Anglo-Saxon coffee house. Here's the bottom line. What did it do? What could you talk about there? I'll bet you, in earlier years, I'll bet you that ship of yours is not going to make it back from India. Bet, wager, you want to wager with me? Okay, yeah. I'll bet you 50 pounds, 5,000 pounds, whatever. Wagering, debate, and sort of personal betting as a game, which you do in casinos in Las Vegas or Hong Kong or the Mediterranean cities, became a financial foundation of insurance companies. Lloyd's of London would sell you insurance for all kinds of things that nobody else would sell you insurance to do. Second, the stock market. I'll bet that company is going to succeed or fail, and I'll give you a certain amount of money if you'll invest it properly. So capital groups, venture capital groups, stock markets, these ideas emerged in London coffee houses, and they became major institutions of London, which plus Amsterdam had certain analogs, and then that became the foundation of, in New Amsterdam, of Wall Street. Second, not just economic, but John Locke. People wrote about liberty, freedom, and they circulated these political tracts attacking the king, attacking the legitimacy of the king in ways that said, how can we have, essentially asking, how can we have a secular ethic which doesn't say the divine right of king, that the king can govern because God gave him the right to govern and his son will carry that on. That's the divine right of kings. And as that theory became more challenged with the rise of secularization, people began to say, well, then maybe, as Thomas Hobbes said, if we didn't have a king, we need to have a dominating animal that would hold down the masses, because if we following contract theory, the world is made up of nasty, brutish, and short people, and they're going to grab They're going to kill people. They'll grab each other's money. There'll be no law. We'll have looting. We'll have crime going on every year. So we need a strong state. Did we hear this from Donald Trump, from Putin, Bolsonaro in Brazil today? Yes, this is a debate issue which continues. We need a strong leadership or we will have chaos. And we have both fighting in different cities today within the US and internationally. Okay, so the Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, these were battled over in coffee houses in London and they published tracts. Could you publish a tract and talk about betting on this in a Paris coffee house? Absolutely not. You'd go to jail or you'd be kicked out of the country, as Karl Marx was kicked out of German city after German city. He went to Paris, they kicked him out of Paris. He went, he kept on going and he stayed in London in the British Museum and he hated, he'd much rather be in Paris or back in Germany, but a lot of other, Nietzsche, Wagner went to Switzerland after they were involved with 1848 revolutions. Okay, so the exceptions on the continent are Switzerland and the Netherlands in part, and then later on, say some of Sweden, a bit, some of the Scandinavian, especially Sweden. But basically, the continental answers were, there's a political hierarchy illustrated most historically important by the King of France and Versailles. So Francis I founded the academy. It then became these castles, and the biggest and best was Versailles outside Paris. And that in turn attracted Catherine the Great from Russia. She came from Russia and was adoring how well the King of France and the kings they didn't have kings at that point, they had dukes, they had people from Prussia, from Brandenburg, from Bavaria. There was no German state at the time. The Italian state, there was no Italian state in 1780. There were little battling city states and so forth, fighting with the Pope and the like. These dukes and others went to one of them was the leading Italian administrator in Corsica, French, and then French administratively, officially, Italian ethnically. And when he wanted to raise his son to become a leader as well, he moved to Versailles so that his son could learn how to live the lifestyle. His son was named Napoleon. And after 1789, when the guillotine defined political authority, Napoleon, a few years later, with his army, took these ideas to Germany, to Austria. He went into Russia, went all through Eastern Europe, and he was welcomed. This is the big point I'm making. He was welcomed by Beethoven. He was welcomed by Hegel. Hegel and Beethoven said Hegel talked about the right, the rational. This is an illustration of Napoleon. The metric system was carried by Napoleon as a way of rationally doing things. They built straight, long roads, not these old paths which were windy. This sense of rationality, which of course the French rationalists in the 18th century had codified, came in through the revolution, but was then carried politically. Globalization is not just Wall Street, it's armies as well. It was carried by the Napoleonic armies across Europe into Russia, all the way over to Egypt, so that you have today in a central square in Paris, aspects of the Egyptian looted cultural properties, which stand on top of towers in Paris. So in these ways, we have a linkage, but my point is this was not just troops beating up on other troops. Napoleon was welcomed by Hegel. He was welcomed by Beethoven, who dedicated, I think, his Third Symphony, called it the Emperor. He changed the name a few years later. Both Hegel and Beethoven felt that Napoleon went too far, and they changed their views. But my point is, Many intellectuals, the parents of Karl Marx, were liberated Jews. Jews could not practice law. Jews could not hold many state positions, etc., in Germany, in many parts of Germany. The Jews were liberated to a considerable degree because of Napoleonic, the Napoleonic invasions, etc. So you have a combination of these globalizing patterns, and maybe we'll say a little more later on, but the counterpart in some ways was who unified Mongolia, China, and what is now Russia, or this former Soviet Union, which extended into Iran and Iraq. The only person who built the second largest, who built the largest continuous land empire in the world was Genghis Khan. So the English Navy built a slightly larger empire, including India, but it was not connected by one big bit of land. The only person who did that was Genghis Khan. And I'm saying that these globalizing patterns were military before they became seen as Wall Street or seen as symphonies or the metric system or social media or the Renaissance arts, all of which inform shopping because aesthetics is important along with these aesthetics of the political system. Okay, so these ideas you have especially in Habermas and others that I've linked with. I'll just in a half a sentence say he was also challenging his own professors, Adorno and Horkheimer, who were closer to Marx, although they all saw themselves as following Marx, but they also joined Marx with Freud, and then in the case of Habermas, increasingly with the American pragmatists, with social interaction, with individual identity in ways that continually link more with where we are in debates among intellectuals and universities and faculty and students around the world. Implicit is that globalization is not just capitalism and Wall Street, there are many other dimensions, and that's a point we'll show with the Boschkin, it's in the Boschkin paper on the reading list. Second general point is analytically, hierarchy and egalitarianism are critical, but they're not totally associated with one type of regime, political or economic, including colonialism. This, in a sense, to generalize, is the answer of Joseph Schumpeter, who was a German Jew, went to Harvard and studied the why and how did this civilized country of Germany become so destroyed by the Nazis. So he studied the English Parliament to try to answer that. And his answer was in the book called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. So he basically challenges those who's saying we can only have democracy if we have capitalism because we need choice. But he goes through that very thoroughly, and as he's an economist in training. But second, socialism is not an answer because it can imply a state which is so interpenetrating. So the advocates have said we can't have, and the Chinese official answer often to human rights is you can't have human rights unless you have people with enough income and equality in terms of provision of services. It's hypocritical to talk about human rights. That's the official Chinese answer from the 1940s through the present in some ways. Schumpeter's answer to that, basically, in the title of the book, is Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And his answer is that no one of these is deterministically related to the other. Capitalism does not always create democracy, nor does socialism, nor does democracy necessarily grow out of capitalism or socialism, that all three have some degree of independence. And that illustrates the general point you heard me say, that race, class, gender, capitalism. I could have added capitalism, socialism. All of these are loosely interrelated, and no one completely or strongly dominates the others. That's the insight which you have from the social scientists who are looking at this, and the historians looking at this more thoughtfully. And so one way is to look at ideal types or dimensions, as we have in our scenes analyses, of things like hierarchy or egalitarianism, or the legitimacy dimensions of Max Weber, or the authenticity dimensions that we have of cosmopolitanism and so forth. So these elements, I'm suggesting, can be valuable to understand what's happening in a city in China today. And the Chinese cities are following this very actively and seriously, is because they're doing explicitly cultural policy. This is not so explicit. It's done more with all kinds of different actors, such as the mayor of Chicago saying to the police, arrest them, the police arresting them, but not using any pepper spray or tear gas. And then the local judicial system in Chicago says, let them go, kick them out. They don't have to go to jail. They don't need to be tried. Just dismiss the charges. They're just young guys that are trying things out. Okay, that's the end of Michigan Avenue. Okay, I'm teasing by invoking competing and challenging and debating moralistic views of the same kinds of things, and saying what's happening here on Michigan Avenue last summer illustrates these same issues that have been fought over and are still being fought over globally. In this way, the moralistic appearance of the ancient Jewish prophet was plural. That is, it was not just Jesus Christ as one individual. It was a cultural perspective, as Max Weber wrote about it. And it tended to be stronger among the ancient Israelites. And they recurred when there were threats of military domination and destruction. So that, at least this is Weber's point, that these prophets would turn up on the street corners and say, Syria is coming, Egypt is coming, we will be destroyed, and Jerusalem was again and again. But the challenge was not just a narrow military challenge. It was a fundamental moralistic, ethical challenge, leading to the first versus the second part of the Bible, which we're still reading about in different ways and using in different ways, you could say, as a legitimation for stronger leadership versus stronger egalitarianism. That these are big issues. Do they affect different countries in different ways? There's a great paper that showed that if you look at all of the colonies in Africa and Asia and the Middle East of the English versus the Germans versus the Belgians versus the French versus the Portuguese versus the Spanish, only that is the English colonies like India and former colonies like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US have had, that is, if you compare them statistically and you try to control other things like access to oil and GNP and the like, there's more democracy historically in the former English colonies than there is in the continental colonies. That directly connects, we could say, with that kind of finding, connects with Habermas's European comparison of the coffee house in London versus the cafes in Paris. I said last time, I'll just remind you that civic groups were illegal in Paris, in France, in the 19th century. They were censored. That is, books were sent. You couldn't publish a tract from John Locke or Karl Marx. It was censored. And we have censorship. We had censorship then, as we have censorship today in more visible, active way in China. So when Mio has talked about the self-censorship of the feminist movement on the social media, certain aspects of the big tech are openly censored. And how about the big tech censoring Donald Trump? Okay, so we have elements of this going on today in ways that we can find parallels. Um, another related point is that history is speeding up. This is Francis Fukuyama has a book called the End of History, but basically that history is speeding up so much that with things like the internet, fandom, weakening of the family, the rise of individualistic quick decisions have meant that what may have taken a century, 500 or 1,000 years ago, may take 6 months now. Ever since this has been recorded, the time of Isaac Newton, the number of scientific papers has doubled in less than a decade. Since Newton, every decade, the number of scientific papers is more than doubled. All right, you put in compound interest, and so we've got massive amounts of science and knowledge of all kinds. The internet, this is not just physics papers, this is also selling you red shoes, yellow shoes, high heels that are 1 millimeter higher, 2 millimeters shorter, health food that has got this combination of healthy carbohydrates, but not dairy, veganism, etc. These things are exploding, as are the fandom internet coordinated leaders, where we had a question on that briefly. People are selling products. So if you want to sell vegan drinks for $29 a bottle instead of $3 it may have cost, if you look at that, is if you can have people embrace that on the internet, that's part of cultural policy? No, in the sense it's not the government is saying that you must do it, but it's a competitive dynamic which can go on in elements of Chinese mass media, as well as answering the questions which classically the economists would say that's not an economic question. It's not, we can't answer it. That is, what are the specific preferences? And we'll leave that to other disciplines. I heard that in workshops here, 5-10 years ago. Economists today are taking this on. They're looking actively to the kinds of very much the same sources I'm citing here. But there's an interpenetration of the social sciences where we can learn from the anthropologists and Levi-Strauss to answer how high should my high heels be, or what should be in my vegan drink, and the like. So history speeding up. The same Fukuyama has a book on trust, and I cite him as he's a social philosopher, but he's a political theorist. But basically, he uses NORC data as to the economist to answer philosophical questions of a sort that used to be asked by Hegel or Aristotle. And so he shows, for example, that you have lower trust and less democracy in countries, or that you have lower trust and lower legitimacy in countries like Korea and Brazil and South Africa, in part because they had stronger political leaders. And in that sense, the idea of hierarchy dominating and transforming the specifics of what's discussed is the same kind of theme that you have. I mentioned Habermas's book. Let me mention explicitly the positive linkage to his professors Adorno and Horkheimer, especially Adorno, whose most famous book around the world was called, who knows the answer to that? This is general culture answer. This is not just American. This is not American. General culture, if you're from China or anywhere. What's Adorno's most famous book? The Authoritarian Personality. They explained the rise of Hitler by saying people who had authoritarian personalities would vote for Hitler. And that same idea was used in America to say, why do we have the appearance of this guy named Joseph McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy of the House Un-American Affairs Activity. Think of nationalism, think of legitimacy, think of strong leadership. These are themes we have today that we had going back. And so where and how the personality links with Hollywood or links with Versailles and links with what you can discuss in a cafe and links with the preference functions of economists, these are things which these theorists have been trying to answer in a more coherent way. So Lipset, in his book Political Man, features many of these same themes joined with a Marxist background of class analysis. And so that's the Frankfurt synthesis of joining the hierarchy and the capitalism of Marx with the authority figure from in part from Freud, and adding the libidinal excesses of Hollywood to advertise and thus use the linkage of I want to look like her and be a beautiful woman in ways that would link with an enticement to buy my brand of shoes or be part of my fandom. And I'm Madonna, so follow me, etc. Or Beyonce, etc. Okay. Maybe it doesn't, let me add one sentence, as you probably know better than I. The fandom idea, several students have written papers about, that you have people like figures, I won't say necessarily Madonna and Beyonce herself, but you have implicitly with them, and sometimes more explicitly, if you look at the lyrics of their songs and you look at the explicit writing by some of the rap and other leaders, they will have questions and answers with their fans. So someone will say, you know, should I leave my boyfriend if he wants me to take care of his children and he only gives me $20 a day? I mean, that kind of question is debated as part of the fandom. And so in a sense, why are people turning to a Madonna or a Beyonce? Because they don't trust their mothers. They don't know their fathers. They don't trust some of the Baptist preachers. They for sure don't trust the teachers or the police. So the fandom has become an alternative authority figure in a more egalitarian context of social media. Okay, so you know all that, but I'm saying these are the roots of it, which we can put together and say, the economists have learned enough of this that they're redefining the importance of, as they say, specifying preference functions to include this kind of thing. Okay, this comes to what I said, physical concepts. How about the title of this course? Local politics. Why do we say local? Why don't we say global studies of the biggest values and the biggest, deepest civilizational concerns in the world? Because we can get a better handle by looking at specific fandom of a specific Madonna or Beyonce, if we look at little places. And this is where Luke will come in later on and talk to us. I have a paper with Carrie Wu, the same guy who published the paper on the Chinese cities. We have a paper on globalization. I don't think it's even published yet, but it basically argues that the idea of, did I say what I meant to say? Urbanization. The urban, what is urban? And this was the question, which was asked explicitly by Mylan Patton last class. What is urban, or what is a civic group, and how much do things change if you go from the rural to the urban? And that the basic answer we give is that was the deepest question that was answered by many of the social science theories in the mid-19th century. And today in China, where we're still in the throes of huge rural to urbanization. The conflicts between the urban and the rural in China are huge and actively, openly debated. And so the Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, the rural-urban continuum, the urbanization, the modernization, these were all joined in the 19th century as physical places. Georg Simmel, Louis Wirth, and so forth. The perspective we're now adding is the core, the most important aspect of the urban or the rural was not the physical distance from a big city, but it was the lifestyle. It was the meaning of urban, just as you had in patriarchal or matriarchal in Brazilian different myths. And if we take that today and say that what we ought to focus on is not the physical urban or the physical name of the neighborhood like Bronzeville, but what are the values of Bronzeville residents and how do they work? How does values and lifestyle in a broad sense of how do these things make a difference? And that in this sense, urbanization can be analyzed, and this is basically what Clifford Geertz and the anthropologists were saying. If we have isolated villages no longer isolated, how can we apply that to, say, a Chinese villages and Chinese rural, or to a college town like Austin or Waco, Texas? And one answer we can use is from surveys, and we can look at how much do people answer questions differently if they're living in rural or urban areas. And we have now not just national surveys, we have global surveys. The two biggest are the World Values Survey, the WVS, and the ISSP, the International Social Survey Program. And these are in over 100 countries around the world. So we have a bunch of questions. So, and just to take two that I've analyzed, how much do you trust people in the national government? How much? And then trust is then often repeated with police. How much do you trust the police? How much do you trust the journalists or the newspapers? How much do you trust local government? And so Carrie Wu analyzed these for different Chinese cities. I looked at this with the World Values Survey data and basically found how much does this differ if we do a regression with some other variables included. How much does rural and urban, how big is the effective population? That is, do rural people have more trust than urban people? Many people say, of course, but it depends. I mean, if you control education, you control income, and then say, is this really, is trust a rural value? And the answer is, in over 100 countries of the world, the answer is rural is insignificant. The two exceptions are parts of rural areas within India and Britain for one size category. Otherwise, rural is generally insignificant. That in a sense, what that says is that rural, in the sense of being, this is obviously one very simple, crude testing of the idea, but it illustrates the theoretical idea that even urban and rural is a civilizational cultural perspective. It's not a place alone. And so trying to disentangle, to separate out the place, but use, not just throw it out, but to say, let's look at the degree, not to say it is or is not, but how strong is the relationship between rural and urban in China, in England, in South Africa, in Waco, Texas, or a small town versus a Chicago neighborhood, and where and how can these questions now be answered more specifically, not only with the field work of Levi-Strauss, but with the surveys which we can have of different neighborhoods. We can look at different Chicago neighborhoods and have different dimensions plotted of people defining, yes, I like this, I do that, I believe this, I don't believe that. We can measure these kinds of things in ways that was not done before, and we can model these with what people buy, where they go to church, kinds of churches. Churches are a critical element, especially for in the African American, well, put more generally, in America, the number one kind of civic organization that is numerically important and critical in many ways, and it's stronger among African Americans, is the church. in France, if you look at the same kinds of questions, what kinds of civic groups are there in France, including churches that Tocqueville wrote about? The answer is challenging civic groups, anti-statism, Doctors Without Borders. By contrast, churches barely count in France. The French are very secular. Okay, so the degree, so I'm saying that's national, but if you go down to the local level, there are certain neighborhoods and certain subgroups within France where people are still very religious. And so where and how religiosity interpenetrates these things and makes it stronger or undermines it within a former Russia, former Soviet area, or in China, where religion is thus officially not accepted. How these interpenetrate are things which we want to address. Okay. Yeah, Public Enemy #1, Chuck D put it, modern day hip hop is Black America's CNN. All right, I'll end with that quote and ask if you have questions or comments.
Yeah,
or
I
challenges of any sort. Someone start. Yeah, Max, go ahead. Max Servitar. And then Mylan Patton after that.
About what exactly you meant when you were saying that the urban-rural divide is more defined by lifestyle, you know, the way people, you know, so it's not like exactly like a relation to where people are physically located around cities, but it's more in the lifestyle. What exactly did you mean by that? Is that in particular practices of daily life? Is that in, you know, the answers people had to these surveys? Are there certain like commonalities within those kind of answers, or is it commonalities within like everyday practices that defined the urban-rural divide in terms of lifestyle?
I mean, quick answer, yes, it is in terms of the practices that we see both ethnographically and in the myths of Levi-Strauss, in the field work of qualitative sociologists of cities, such as USC sociology PhD students, as well as in the surveys, I would say, of questions like how much do you trust the national government, as well as in items such as how close are you to your neighbors? That is the idea that the small town is a socially integrated, tight network, connected socially institution. So, I mean, a quick answer, I mean, from Zimmel up through Louis Wirth, through many others, is that the city is a cold, impersonal place. And the primary group was rediscovered in the 50s, basically, in finding in places like Bronzeville that a single mother, if you just look at the demographic data, she's not married, therefore she's isolated, therefore that's disorganized, therefore there's no institution. Wrong. Because if you ask her, she has connection and she may share values and support from her sister, from her mother, from her grandmother. And that degree of personal relationship combined with the values that I will take care of the children of my sister and the like is a value which is different, which is now being challenged, if we go to the other extreme, in China and Korea. That if you listen on to look at Chinese social media, or take Korea, to not just, I don't want to criticize China, take Korea, where the national government said, we're not going to provide the same degree of support for the elderly and retired persons, but we'll leave it to the specific decision of the mayors. And so some Korean cities said, you know, we're not going to support elderly people at all. And so some of the children of those families said, neither am I. You know, I'm not going to take care of my parents and grandparents. And so you had grandparents sleeping in park benches in towns in Korea. This was maybe 10 years ago. This became a hot issue in Korea. And the mayors in those towns said, it's not our responsibility to take care of the family duties. It's the duty of the children to take care of their parents. Donald Trump? Okay, so that style that this welfare state does not extend to the family is being challenged in Asia with some, obviously much less than in the West, but I'm saying this is not a completely accepted, and it's become a publicly debated issue in South Korea, in China, in Japan today, Taiwan as well. These were big, and so the degree of, so in that sense, how you answer and especially implement these decisions are what people in individual families will respond to differently. And this is almost exactly the question that Ji Young Kim asked when we talked about it in the last 2 days. Okay, so I mean that's a quick answer, and I'm trying to say many methods, many types of answers can lead to similar results. Mylan Patton.
And you mentioned, Professor, about the urban rural differences. And when you conducted your research across the globe, you did not see as many, changes, except for a few exceptions. I wonder if, I want to hear your thoughts on whether there's another factor you could implement to more or less see those changes, whether it be the influence of the church, a proximity or whatnot, or even implementing the suburban, geographical area and contrasting it with the two may lead to findings from differences.
Yeah, the answer is yes, probably probably all of those are put differently. If you just use, one surrogate that is widely used in social science is just to take population size. Instead of saying what you can call, and so one measure of urbanity is just population size. So if you take people living in or near a very big city versus a very small town, how much does that explain in terms of, say, school attainment, crime rates, going to church, a bunch of other things? And the point is, if you look at what we're called, say, simple relationships, if you just say, let's look at more rural and more urban people, do they go to church or not, you may find positive relationships. But if you add the factors that I put your finger on, churches, you didn't mention education, but if you add, say, education, income, going to church, and a few more of these, the power, or let's see, the ostensible power, the spurious relationship of urban with crime and so forth gets weaker and weaker and weaker. So that's the quick answer. So I would say, look at the relationship between population size and urban in the social science literature, and there's a massive amount of work that deals with exactly this. In a global context, I would say that most of it has been within one nation, but we're increasingly getting this globally. But the simple point I'm making is that nations explain less and less. And other factors like, say, education explains a lot more. That is, you've got educated Chinese and educated Koreans that maybe are Indians that are much closer to people who are professors at Oxford than they are to poor village Indians, Asian Indians, etc. So I'm not saying there's any one factor for sure. Life is multi-causal, but it's not random. That's my point. Even if we're only explaining 15, 20% and more, if we get to a particular village, if we get to subgroups, for sure, we can raise it. But the point is, we will, or put differently, we will cover in the different sections of the course some of the best answers that we've got from the social sciences as to why these things tend to work and why population gets weaker and why global gets more important. At the same time, that we will also be continually modest of saying a lot of this is I won't say noise, but it is individuals are different enough from each other that some Korean kids don't want to take care of their grandparents or their parents. And some mayors will say, then those parents, if they're in a park bench, blame the children, but don't blame the mayor. Okay. Aji Vijay.
Yeah, hi, Professor. I just want to revisit. I think you had a discussion about like amenities earlier on, and just the idea that some economists were studying non-market-based goods, so things like clean air of that nature. I was just curious if they were making value judgments on it, in the sense that, like, were they suggesting that, let's say, the governing party can or should prioritize non-market-based goods in order to, let's say, either improve trust of the population with the government or improve, let's say, their welfare? Or was it more one of the things like they were bringing the concept to light in terms of it wasn't really highlighted yet in history at that point?
Yeah, I'd say the clearest answer to that is illustrated by the concept which came from Alfred Marshall of externalities. And the most powerful was the basis of part of the Nobel Prize. The first Nobel Prize in economics went to Paul Samuelson, and his key paper was called The Pure Theory of Public Goods. So the public good concept is more expansive, and it basically refers to things like clean air, security, feeling comfortable because of things which are shared, like clean air. But his basic argument, and this was the challenge, was that the ways that these can get revealed can be ideally studied through an ideal market. And so if you have a competitive market for shoes, that can generate the quantity and number of red shoes and yellow shoes through the market process. If you try to do that for clean air, it doesn't work, because there is no way that institutionally that voting or referenda or talking to people or public debates involve a lot of rhetoric and a lot of lying, he would even say. He may not have called it that. He would talk about deception or exaggeration, or he had more, it's a very serious, thoughtful kind of paper, but it basically, it led basically to economists leaving politics out and not trying to study it for about 20 years. Then along came the Public Choice Group with James Buchanan, Chicago economist, and he and Gordon Tullock started the Public Choice Group, and that in turn swamped political science. So political theorists today, political science uses a lot of the economic, but they use the non-market, because political scientists study non-markets. They study elections, city council, parties, and so forth, civic groups, and how these penetrate the political decisions. But because so let me, and maybe that's but in terms of the ideology of is it right or good or bad, economists are more explicit than most other social scientists in saying the normative answer is use the market, because if you use the market, then you get the right number of yellow and red shoes. But then, say, Anthony Downs in his book, An Economic Theory of Democracy, will immediately say, at the end of each chapter, well, if we weaken that assumption that we don't have freedom of entry, we don't have perfect competition, how much will we not get cleaner air, or how much will we get less good responsive political leaders if we don't have a multi-party versus a two-party political system? So in that way, Downs illustrates the ways that the public choice theorists in political science have now been answering this by bringing in explicit, so I said assumptions is the way that Downs often does it in the book, but which we can in this course try to say, how much does this vary empirically by cities? So having local units that are actually doing these things, instead of saying, assume it away, let's say, how much are they doing it in this or that different rural Chinese village, or this or that rural area of South Africa or Chicago? So we can begin to, and the economists have now begun to realize, some economists have begun to realize this, and so they're studying the NORC data where they're using ethnographic material on Chicago neighborhoods, et cetera. Okay. We're just a little over time. We will continue briefly if we have some office hour questions, but for now, we will declare the session over and look forward to seeing you next Monday.